Okay, great. Should we, yeah. Okay, so good morning, everyone. And let's use this opportunity to have our guests here in New York to start off the week with a very substantive discussion on conflict prevention and peace building. Before we get to our guests, I just want to say a couple words on why we're here and how we got here and how we got to a position to host Tim Sisk. We have, in fact, we are organizing a research series which is based on the inputs paper for the UN World Bank study. It's a joint study of conflict prevention and development. This is the study that really looks into finding evidence base and theoretical underpinnings for a new sustaining peace framework. It's based on several of initiatives within the UN, some of which really date back to Agenda 2030 and then the sustaining peace resolutions. Those are the dual resolutions. 2282 in Security Council and also UNGA. These resolutions set pace for policy development in terms of sustaining peace, based on both the review of the peacekeeping operations and the review of the peace building architecture. It's also taking into account the review of the implementation of 3025, so women, peace, and security, but also looking into a much newer framework that has increasingly showed significance for us, and that's the 2050 resolution on youth and peace building. So that is on the UN side, and then on the bank side, we have the new IDA 17, which added specifically $14.7 billion, specifically for countries that are conflict affected. And given these background and these trends, there was an acknowledgement that working together between the World Bank and the UN will be very productive. And so we are basically having a precedent in this regard in terms of having a joint team and a joint group that is trying to set this agenda. This process should really culminate in a short summary report that is going to be ready for the UNGA this year and for the joint board meeting of the World Bank and IMF later on. And so the final and the full scale report, about 200 pages, should be done by the end of this year. So as part of this effort, we have commissioned a number of papers that look into different dimensions of conflict prevention. We're mostly looking at conflict trends and also other trends that impact on conflict dynamics more generally. And we're looking at the particular evidence base and where is the research really going, also the theoretical considerations, in trying to update what has been done with the World Development Report 2011. So in this context, obviously, we have looked into the issues of social cohesion and some of the key issues for understanding conflict prevention, and trying to see how that fit in the new framework that looks at conflict prevention as having a very different time horizon. And also the one that wants to look at both vertical and horizontal dimensions in which conflict manifests itself. In this regard, we were very fortunate to have the support of our guest today, Tim Sisk, who has in fact been working with us for a number of years and is in a very good position to in fact reflect on where we were and also try to give us some guidance as where we could be going. And therefore we do have a a concept of bridging social coherence, which I think Tim is going to tell us a little bit about here, and also give us an indication of how we can go about building, as being external actors that are very much involved in the political economy of the country ourselves, going through the direct and indirect approach, and what do these particular approaches really entail. So our guest today is the Professor of International and Comparative Politics at the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at University of Denver. He is also a faculty member of the Sei-Chu Kang Center for International Security Diplomacy at the same school, and also Associate Fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy in Switzerland. So with this, I'd like to let Tim give us a presentation, and we'll follow it with Q&A.
Thank you, Georgie, and good morning, everyone. Morning to those online as well. I think it may be the first time in my professional career that I've started a presentation with an apology, but I want to apologize for the Monday morning seminar. This had to do with my schedule. I have a grantees meeting here in New York that starts at noon, but I wanted to come by, and Georgie suggested a small seminar. So again, apologies for the Monday morning seminar. It could be the worst time to try to hold the seminar, but thank you for coming and for your attention. No, I'm very pleased to be involved in this background paper, preparing this background paper for the World Bank and UNDP study on conflict prevention. I think it was, well, in the late 1990s, almost 20 years ago now, that the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict produced its mammoth report on conflict prevention. I had the opportunity to be involved in that some time ago, so I'm very pleased on this one. As well, to present the work on social cohesion and social cohesion programming, together with a colleague at William Jewell College in Missouri, Fletcher Cox. I've been involved in a 2-year project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation here in New York as part of their Religion and International Affairs Initiative, where we, well, I'll introduce some of the methodology for that study and some of the findings which feed into this background paper. But for me, this concept of social cohesion is really very interesting. I mean, it's an engaging topic because on the one hand, social cohesion is something that we can sort of think and feel and see in any kind of given context. I think people have the capacity to know when there's a cohesion within a group or not. But also social cohesion has increasingly been something that development assistance seeks to foster, as Georgie said, either directly or indirectly. And so this has been a very engaging process for me to sort of unpack what social cohesion means and to really point out, I think, increasingly what I see this difference, which was also mentioned between bonding social cohesion, bridging social cohesion, and linking. Now, I didn't do much with linking in the paper. The paper primarily focuses on bridging social cohesion, but this is a very interesting topic as well, to think about how these various forms or functions or dimensions of social cohesion relate one to another. So I'll get into all of that. It's a very long-winded introduction to this presentation, which is based on the background paper. Actually, fortunately, in our chatting just now, there's one more opportunity to revise this this paper before it goes into the stream of being aggregated into the broader report. So I would be very keen on any comments or suggestions or reflections you may have. Okay, very good. I start out the presentation here with an overview of the global context. And from the work that we see on, sorry, I'm going to turn around here. My PowerPoint here doesn't match the one up there, so I'm going to work with this one. And I think it's the correct version. I'm pretty sure it is. So But basically, sorry, so it was a little off step there, but I wanted to start out with the global context of the monitoring organizations that look at, for example, threats against minorities globally. It's a good place to start, and indeed we see worsening conditions of so-called ethnic conflict. And I always put that in quotation marks because I don't want to presume that conflict is driven by ethnicity. It may be more manifested in terms of ethnicity, but that's something that we can chat about as well. Assessing social cohesion, a clear definition and a framework of analysis, which I think will also get into some of the drivers of concern about what undermines social cohesion, which is the next section, dealing with the importance of the role of historical narratives as well as contemporary inequalities, and I think this will come out. With regard to bridging social cohesion, which I'll focus on particularly, we want to take a look at the notion of social bonds and network approaches. Network approach is a very interesting analysis, and to me this is the important linkage between social cohesion and conflict prevention. When various actors on the ground, either civil society organizations, religious leaders, eminent persons within a community, under what conditions can they act to prevent conflict from escalating? So this is, to me, the crux of the concern, which has, I think, major implications for development assistance. Sort of identifying those key agents and how this mechanism operates may be very important. Then some of the lessons learned, not really lessons learned, but research findings on direct and indirect approaches, and that I think will be particularly of interest to those who are involved in program and project design or approving programs and projects coming in from UN country teams or otherwise. And some of the advantages, disadvantages, and maybe risks of different types of approaches. Personally, I think there are greater risks to direct social cohesion programming than indirect, and I think that's my principal finding and message in terms of evaluation, and then just a few words of conclusion. So very good that the PowerPoint on the screen is the correct one. I can tell by the location of the photo. So I did a little early morning revision on this. So very good. So we start the paper with a look at the Terai region of Nepal, where of course social cohesion has been since the 2006 peace agreement. In Nepal, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, social cohesion is sort of written into the DNA of Nepal in terms of the uplifting of marginalized communities, the importance of inclusivity in the peace process. It's written right into the CPA about the underlying drivers of conflict associated with marginalization, associated with inequality. And in some research, there's a sort of a spatial dimension of this in Nepal as well, in terms of conflict between hill people and plains people, the sort of the hill dwellers, as they're known in that context, and those on the Terai, the various groups, and particularly in the most recent conflict in the run-up to local elections in Nepal, which will unfold next week and then in early June in 2 rounds, of course, in several provinces of Nepal under the new 2015 constitution, that there have been demands for ethnic federation or ethnic federalism in the constitution-making process. And then now that the Constitution has been more or less adopted, demands that the local election should be contingent on constitutional reform. The upshot of this is there's another round of violence, an earlier round of violence had also occurred in the Terai region in March 2017. And this sort of, what we've seen in Nepal essentially is new forms of ethnic mobilization. Some have even argued the construction of new ethnic identities in what is the Medes and who are the Medesi in this process of democratic transition. So this is not surprising to those who've looked at democratic transitions to see ethnic mobilization that occurs in the context of such transitions. I started my career in South Africa as a journalist, and we chatted about this, and certainly through the course of that transition we saw a similar sort of ethnic mobilization, and it's fairly deep in the literature as well. But yet we've got 10 years of programming and projects in Nepal that were very specifically designed to address social cohesion. Some of these were World Bank projects, many UNDP projects, and then a broader range of bilateral donors and development assistance providers and transnational NGOs that have been very directly involved in saying, okay, social cohesion is critical to prevent further conflict in Nepal, either to prevent recurrence or to prevent the kind of clashes between police and protesters or armed violence even that we've seen in the Nepal region. And my view on the Nepal context, and we spent much more time on it, is that social cohesion is highly limited by the underlying conditions of the overlap between identity and inequality in Nepal, or at least perceptions of such inequality has been fairly well documented in the literature. So how can there be social cohesion in a context in which there is sort of structured, hierarchical relationships in society? What the eminent scholar of ethnic conflict, Don Horowitz, once called, ranked societies, where social groups are more or less ranked, both in terms of economic, political, and social discrimination. So it's just an anecdote to start us off on the three principal questions that the paper addresses. The first is this question of, well, what is social cohesion? It could be everything, and therefore be nothing in terms of a concept. So the more a concept is sort of stretched, the less meaningful it becomes. And yet in practitioner practice, in seminars and programs that I've been involved with over the last couple of years, it seems like it's a buzzword that everyone sort of gravitates to, a bit like resilience, I would add. But nonetheless, if everyone's gravitating to it as a concept and a meaningful concept, right, sociologists, development assistance providers, journalists even, then it does have it does have legs, I would say. It is an important concept, and we have to unpack it and think about, well, what is social cohesion? And so I'll answer that question in just a moment, but that's the first question of the paper. Secondly, I wanted to constrain the sort of scope of the paper primarily to ethnically fractured societies, what in the literature is known as deeply divided societies. Well, in this day and age of populism, xenophobia, discrimination, we might wonder, well, where do we find non-divided societies? But in the literature, there is a sort of a distinction of deeply divided societies as those in which politics, society, economic relationships strongly follow patterns of identity. And again, I don't want to prejudge that this is sort of an ethnic identity. We might, for example, look in the contemporary MENA region and see more sectarianization. There's a new book out with that title by a couple of colleagues of mine, Nader Hashemi and Danny Pastel. In fact, they're in London today with a number of launch events for that book on sectarianization in the Middle East. And then the third question here, I guess the second question, how do prevention-oriented program interventions seek to promote social cohesion? The very important question, what do we see in terms of the types of program and projects that are out there? And then thirdly, what are the findings from this research project that I mentioned, which I'll highlight again in just a moment. The global context. There is no very precise database on the extent to which ethnic conflict is waxing or waning globally. That we have to make inferences from either the reporting of organizations such as the Minority Rights Group International, which in December released its Peoples Under Threat report, or we have to rely on some interpretation of the role of identity in overall conflict dynamics. So when I look at the data from the Center for Systemic Peace or the Uppsala data and see rising armed conflict globally, and we start to get into the various contexts, many of which are highlighted in the Minority Rights Group report, I see a worsening global context. And so certainly, to me, this harks back to a period of around sort of 1990 to perhaps around 2000, in which there was a very similar sort of upsurge in the context of the transitions often from the former Soviet space, but other places as well, in terms of a rise of ethnic conflict. Certainly 1994 in Rwanda is important in this regard. But also from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, the annual report, annual statement of the High Commissioner at the end of December last year had this very strong quotation here about a chill wind blowing globally, nationalism, traditionalism that justifies a racist, xenophobic, sexist, homophobic, and other forms of blatant discrimination. And so we do see this as a global pattern. I think probably the best monitoring organization that I would turn to for these types of issues would be the Minority Rights Group International. Although I think it's important that not all manifestations of identity-based conflict involve majorities discriminating against minorities. And this was a very good point that a reviewer made in the original draft of the paper. And again, as someone who started their career in the mid-'80s in South Africa, was a journalist there, to have dominant minority regimes, absolutely. And the case of Syria was also pointed out in this regard. But the Minority Rights Group has highlighted this is based on their index of peoples under threat, sort of their top 20 there on the first list. But then I looked at that list and I thought, well, this is very incomplete in terms of the range of contexts in which identity-related conflict has been manifested in 2017. So just sort of picking through some of the headlines when I've seen the new tensions or revived tensions arising over Nagorno-Karabakh, Macedonia. Perhaps you saw the pictures from the parliament of the sort of fight that happened there on the parliament floor in Macedonia. Indonesia, with the controversy around the mayor of Jakarta, Ahok, and some of the mobilization of Islamist orientations in Indonesia. Kenya, in the run-up to the elections later this year, a Republic of Georgia, etc., in which there may be heightened tensions globally. So I'm typically not an alarmist. But in this context of the current period, I think conflict prevention on identity-related issues is, in fact, very important. So what is social cohesion? I don't know how much time we have. This could be a 3-hour seminar. This could be the introduction of the 3-hour seminar, or indeed, as perhaps a former student of mine here, Christy Sletton, would realize, yeah, this guy can talk for 3 hours, no problem. I won't do that this morning. I'm going to try to put out the very pithy definition. I think social cohesion, we sort of see a dual definition in terms of the common usage today within our community of scholars and practitioners. One is just sort of a straightforward assessment. To what extent is there cohesion within any particular society? And what are the dimensions or manifestations of that? A very interesting presentation some time ago, last March actually, just a few months ago, a colleague who's doing research on the Bosnian Croat Federation. And she's a sociologist. Her name is Maja Pistilović-Halilović. Okay? And she's doing very interesting research on schools in the Bosnian Croat Federation and looking at this principle of 2 schools under 1 roof, where the kids from the Croat community go to the very same school in the morning. The kids from the Bosniak go to the very same school in the afternoon. There's a gate right down the middle that separates, actually physically separates the building. It's painted in 2 different colors. Very interesting case studies on this policy of 2 schools under 1 roof. But we see that social cohesion here is something that we could look at and evaluate as endogenous property of society. More recently, the term has been used to say, well, how do development assistance, using programs and projects and capacity development work, how can social cohesion be fostered through interventions? So this is about building or fostering, and then we pull out our UNDP lexicon of verbs, assisting, different ways to promote social cohesion. So it's an outcome of particular interventions, right? Where you could say, well, we had a religious dialogue that builds social cohesion. We look at commonalities among various faith traditions. The principle is very deep in the literature. I always think of going back to Emil Durkheim's study on suicide, and the sort of founding of the modern social sciences, that the more a person, that suicide is not just a matter of personal belief, it's about social networks and embeddedness in social networks, and alienation is a vulnerability for suicide, as well as what we've seen in some of the literature on violent extremism, is that alienation, feeling like you don't belong in a particular society, can be, at an individual level, is related to social cohesion. It's really gained currency in recent years, and I'm beginning to think, and this is more of a plausible hypothesis rather than any kind of finding, is that it emanates, the focus on social cohesion today emanates a little bit from our kind of concern that, well, a state building cannot be technical. It can't simply deal with empowering the state. There has to be a state-society dimension. So then we get into, well, what is the societal dimension of state building? It's like, well, how do you build a state when the society on which that state rests is deeply fractured? And so I think the focus on social cohesion may come from some concerns about the state building agenda, thus linking it to a certain extent to the 2011 WDR. Look at social cohesion in terms of fostering or promoting social cohesion, engaging groups that are excluded. So it's looking at patterns of exclusion and marginalization and being very deliberate to say, well, if the cause of conflict in Nepal is inequality, marginalization, exclusion, then peace building and preventing conflict recurrence in Nepal is about remediating these exclusions. Second would be increasing social capital, so building trust within society. And what is trust? And that is yet another kind of question that we could raise. I tend to think of it more almost in rational terms. I'll just throw it out there and leave it, and which is the expectation of reciprocity. But belonging, participation, trust in society, this becomes very important. And trust at what level? That's something that I think would be very useful to think about, is that, well, it's one thing to trust, to have a level of trust in terms of social cohesion, where you say, yeah, I'll engage in an economic exchange relationship with this person, right? Versus I'm okay with my daughter marrying a person of this identity, right? These are much different kinds of things, and social psychology would point out that the latter is probably the most difficult in terms of where people think that there's a degree of social cohesion. It comes to intermarriage, and the gender dimension is actually there in the literature as well. So that's not just an example I pulled out of my hat. That is actually in the literature, particularly on stigmatization. And third would be developing responsive and effective state institutions as part of social cohesion. And I'll explain that in just a moment. So in order to further unpack this, Fletcher, Cox, and myself, we went through a lot of the literature, and there's a lot of good literature on social cohesion. We came up, we liked this particular framework and orientation the best, which would suggest that there are horizontal and vertical dimensions. When I think about the horizontal dimensions, this is relations within society at the sometimes called the quotidian level. I'll get back to that awful term in just a moment, the sort of everyday level. And vertical, it's cohesion between citizens and the state. And then the other two components would be sort of, well, what can be objectively measured, including, for example, rates of cross-community intermarriage, although that may be a false friend in terms of these kinds of issues. Or subjective, going to the World Values Survey or going to Eurobarometer or others in thinking through, well, what are the subjective aspects? And you can see every good presentation requires, by an academic at least, a 2x2 matrix, right? And so I have that for this presentation as well. You can see where colleagues, Chan and colleagues, sort of mapped different elements of social cohesion, drawing from the literature, of course, on social capital, from which this derives, as a broader definition. However, for the purposes of the paper, let me just go back for a quick moment. For the purposes of the paper, another good reviewer comment was not to throw everything in the kitchen sink, to focus primarily on horizontal social cohesion. And I should mention that there is a book coming out any day now. Actually, we expect to be done. Everything's done by Palgrave on this project. So there'll be a much more further conceptual development there that wasn't able to do in the paper. And then we kind of go back and look at, well, from all of our literature on drivers of conflict, aspects of multidimensionality, etc., what are the factors that focus, that affect social cohesion? And again, each of these would be worthy of a very deep analysis, right? A kind of a long discussion about, well, historical narratives. But I draw on the work of Eric Hobsbawm, the eminent British historian, who talks about the invented tradition of creating national identity. So we might think of this in the context of the Rohingya in Myanmar, about how people, groups may be defined out of the national identity. And this is a sort of a construction over time. And I come at this, we could get back into theories of ethnicity. Not enough time for that, but we would have our primordialist, our instrumentalist, and our constructivist approaches. And I buy right into constructivism. The argument is that social cohesion has been constructed historically, national identity, historical narrative, who belongs. It can be reconstructed in different ways, through symbolisms, etc.
By changing narratives, the scripts, there's a whole process to do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we've done that very well in Chiang Mai. There's, a lot of NGOs work in Chiang Mai, working with the Myanmar civil society from, the Buddhist Rakhine civil society in Chiang Mai, they do it. So there are a lot. I think there are some professors from the Eastern Mennonite University who are very much engaged in this.
Yes.
Jane Doherty and John Paul Lederer.
And I thought maybe John Paul's fingerprints.
Yeah, no, it's the same thing of changing scripts. So constructing new identities and new ways of thinking and new ways of relating.
Absolutely. And this has been, I think, part of the process in Nepal, really, is to rethink. And there's debate and discussion about what makes us Nepali.
I'm from Nepal, I'm Nepali.
Oh, okay, very good. I wanted
Nepal,
to be
I think it's your third point, the political capture and predatory politics.
Yes.
That defines ethnic mobilization, that defines what is included, what is excluded, including women. And then there is the whole theory, if women are excluded so much, why aren't women getting radical and violent, but the ethnic part is getting, and I think it's the political capture. I mean, that's my thing. But then I'm Pahari and living in the Mabes, dual identity, so.
Very interesting.
Well,
I thought I might touch a nerve or otherwise, speak to someone's very direct interest. So I'm very pleased for the comment because, this is, I'm not here saying I've cracked the code on social cohesion because this changing of national narratives, how that occurs. Is it through textbooks or other things, where you think to youth and education? This becomes a very important...
Sorry, I do want to stop this, but on changing narratives and changing identities and what it means, at least from Nepal's experience and seeing it very close and personal, for me, it's even like a policy-making process, reforms can do that. And the drafting of the new constitution was actually supposed to have created a new narrative for Nepal.
Yes.
Right? Which, to some extent it did, to some extent it didn't. Right? So when you're talking about the local elections, 20 years we've not had local elections. So how do we, now we are having local elections. Federalism discussions was 2006 to 96, I think, from then onwards, right?
Yes.
During the war onwards, right? So the constitution drafting process was supposed to have been, and at least as a Nepali, we felt like this is where we create a new narrative for New Nepal.
Yes.
We don't use the word New Nepal anymore, right? I think we've gone backwards, right? So also seeing how these processes can allow for new narratives to happen, but for that to happen, the policy making itself has to be inclusive.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more, because this question of social cohesion and within the broader context of politics, which is the third point here, and the second and third point would be that you can't just focus on the horizontal aspects of society if one lives in a context in which the overall national politics are soured or divisive. So in some of the cases that we've looked at here, Bosnia, Iraq, Lebanon, the so-called consociational cases, well, this is very clear that you can't just focus on the everyday, on the horizontal dimensions of social cohesion, because they happen within a context, a political context, which is very much the second point about the role of institutions, particularly electoral processes, and how political elites construct a social cohesion in electoral processes. And when they win and lose, this was a bigger point to make than it was earlier than it is now, because we have the experience of 2016 in the United States, which was exactly this kind of phenomenon, which was warned against as early as the early 70s about you have playing the ethnic card, the prism of politics, and how political institutions, particularly the Electoral College in the United States, lead to sort of minimum winning coalitions. So that's my political sciencey moment in the presentation. The third is the one you mentioned as well, when you have sort of patronage and politics that occur along identity lines. It's a very strong finding out of Kenya, for example, that under conditions of political capture, which is also then a risk for development assistance. I will talk about that in just a moment with some other projects. But this question of patrimonialism and patronage. The other is this sort of a linkage between social and economic dimensions. And I know there's a paper in the background, another background paper being produced on horizontal inequalities. But this is when you have the overlap of identity, exclusion, and inequality. And from my own point of view, I would point out that these are not just economic and social phenomenon, that there is a social psychological dimension of inequality and of exclusion along identity lines. And again, I'll go back to the kind of jargon of the literature. This would be known as relative group worth, and the notion, or relative status deprivation, to borrow from social psychology. And this notion of relative status deprivation means I'm not a citizen in my own country. I'm not fully respected. I'm not, I'm not seen as worthy as others because of identity, because of inequality and exclusion, economic marginalization. And this becomes very powerful in terms of conflict drivers, the psychological dimension, the social psychological dimension of this. There's also literature on where if we're dealing with conflict-affected countries, we see that during the course of conflict, there is a retreat often into identity as a form of social safety, let's say, and that there's a hardening of identity. So then when these get sort of institutionalized in the Dayton Peace Agreement or in the Taif Accord in Lebanon or in sectarianized political structures, this can harden ethnic identity. And this becomes, again, a challenge for development assistance providers because it depends very much on the kind of context analysis. And then there is this notion of quotidian or everyday interactions of social cohesion. And in this regard, I would just highlight there's a sort of now a parallel kind of approach. I like Roger McGinty's work on everyday peace indicators, which is sort of, rather than looking at attitudes or looking at was the peace agreement implemented, sort of our 5-year measure of recurrence. No, let's look at the sort of everyday peace indicators, how much are neighborhoods demarcated, like in the Northern Ireland context, are the murals, coming down, or are they still up, these sort of everyday kinds of evaluations.
Can I ask you a question on everyday peace and the everyday dynamics of interaction?
Yes.
So that also includes dependency, the economic dependency,
Absolutely.
interactions, because I think that also, like I'm just thinking in terms of Nepal also, see that in Myanmar too, there's a lot of, like in Rakhine, you see a lot of dependency which is now being severe.
Mm-hmm.
The other question I had, and in that is like now taking the example of Rakhine, historically, the Muslims and the Buddhists never lived together. There's never an integrated village. You have a Muslim village, you have a Rakhine village, right? They have historically a Muslim school, a Rakhine school, a Buddhist school. And they're literally 1 minute apart, but the Muslim kids go there historically. And then while I was working there, and then we were talking, there was always the thing of social cohesion, and there were many in the international community said, oh no, but they have to interact. But historically they had never interacted, Oh, but you have to have one school, right? And even those people are like, they don't know what it's like to have one school or live in one village. So our outside views on what cohesion should be in a society, I think
So
we just don't.
that brings the question of international development assistance and the local context.
Yeah.
But let's wait for
Okay.
more detailed questions. Yeah,
Okay.
I would love to actually continue that conversation.
Yeah, I would too, because I still absolutely confess to being a bit perplexed about whether social cohesion is, and maybe this is better for discussion, but I'll put it out there quickly and then move along so I can go through the presentation. But there is a big debate in the literature about whether sort of consensually unified, cohesive, confident groups living side by side is better for peace than some sort of artificial, arguably, or incentivized integration. So this is a broader question and a very good one. So on the project that I mentioned, 2.5 year, a 3-year research project, we looked at peace building and social cohesion. It's a little bit different, although we could define sustainable peace building and relate it to conflict prevention. But we conducted 2.5 year research projects where we developed an assessment approach to social cohesion, a fairly extensive one, drawn from the comparative literature. We put together, with the help of the Henry Luce Foundation, chapter teams that involved Western scholars working with local scholars, because you may have a Western scholar that thinks they know everything there is to know about a particular context, but having that sort of inside perspective is critical. And you can see our case selection on the left-hand side. And then we put together, of course, the research to policy, trying to relate it to policies on social cohesion, and case-specific and comparative findings that emanate. And that book is coming out, again, from Palgrave Macmillan, just in a few days, actually. But this is, I thought, what was most helpful to you all would be, well, how do we begin to assess social cohesion? A very complicated topic. We looked at the deep historical context and the proximate empirical data on conflict assessment. So each of these country-level analyses, for example, will have a tracking of conflict trends. And then to get into the horizontal analysis, the most important, looking at, well, what are the nature of identity cleavages and what are the best ways to sort of engage in assessment. What I find is often there is a simplification of societies that happens often probably through news media, to suggest that there are 2 groups or there are 3 groups, and the 3 groups are these, and they're cohesive, and you can go on the CIA World Fact Book, and they'll sort of have them listed there, and there you've got it, that, there are 3 major groups in Nigeria. Well, no, Nigeria has anywhere from 80 to 270 distinct identity groups, and it depends on how you do the assessment. Is it home language use? Is it self-description? What are the measures that one looks at in terms of the identity cleavages? Horizontal inequalities I mentioned. There's also the sort of greed versus grievance debate about the underlying drivers in terms of economic drivers versus social drivers, including land. And land, we found, was a critical variable across all of the cases. It may have been a factor of case selection, or it may be that land identity nexus, as we've inelegantly described it here, is critical. And then the process of mobilization, again, being a constructivist, I look at sort of how do elites articulate, how do mid-level elites articulate a group mobilization. We looked further at the vertical dimensions. I'd be happy to chat about any of these, but these are more the vertical dimensions that we looked at, slightly outside the scope of the paper for the conflict prevention report, as well as transnational dimensions, which can be very important. I think we all appreciate the role of diaspora, communities, the development cooperation analysis. In each of these cases, are donors coherent in their approaches to promoting social cohesion? The answer is not very often, if at all, in many of the cases that we looked at, and then trying to draw some lessons learned. A number of case-specific findings, and again, I'd be very happy to share. The case summaries are online. I'd be happy to share with anyone where summaries of these cases can be found. And then the book, I'm not suggesting everybody run out and buy the book, but perhaps the library would acquire it, or I just send you a PDF of the actual country level write-ups. But you can see these are the titles of the various chapters in it, and we don't have time to go through each of them, but we can see that this question of social cohesion really resonated across these various cases. So what are the principal findings from this? One is that we sort of distinguish between direct and indirect approaches. So what's the difference? It's very, very challenging to think about, but I think, to me, a direct approach to social cohesion is one that actually has an explicit objective, perhaps written into the pro-doc, all right? I can say that here in UNDP, and everybody knows what I mean. That the aim of this project is to promote social cohesion. And it could be a dialogue project, and the dialogue projects are very common. I pulled out the logo of the Lebanese Palestinian Dialogue Committee in Lebanon. The Palestinians are non-citizens in Lebanon, and so this was in a sort of informal mechanism supported by UNDP to bridge the gap between Lebanese society and the Palestinians living mostly in the 12 refugee camps in Lebanon. National and local dialogues is a very interesting area. We may have sort of national dialogue processes. Probably the most common manifestation of this form of direct approach in terms of dialogue processes would be interfaith dialogues. So I went to Biratnagar in the Terai region. Oh, okay, very good. I spent 2 days with the Interreligious Council of Biratnagar. Very interesting 2 days, probably the most interesting 2 days of that particular year, I think. And then I would also place the infrastructures for peace, the designing architectures for peace, as a form of direct social cohesion programming. Mainly because they're explicit in promoting a social integration or promoting networks at the local level. There's also indirect approaches, and indirect approaches I think are very interesting, where maybe the aim is some other outcome, a development outcome, or a violence reduction, as you can see, armed violence reduction, but they have the effect of promoting social cohesion almost as a side benefit of other work. So armed violence reduction strategies, I'm quite sure you're all familiar with the various armed violence reduction approaches, particularly, for example, in urban settings. I'm thinking of some of the work of Small Arms Survey on local, violence in urban settings. cross-cutting civil society. And this is where we get into bridging social cohesion, and this is what I'm really about. In the paper, I just pulled out 2 areas in which this sort of is an indirect approach to promoting social cohesion. One is in the area of environmental peacemaking and environmental peace building. That is, if one can get a community involved in a kind of a water project that builds interdependencies, not dependency, but interdependencies, that this can have the effect of building social cohesion of UNEP kind of approaches. The other would be a little side interest I have, not a side interest, but a somewhat significant interest in sport for peace programming and the approach of that for social cohesion, particularly among youth, and this is very interesting. I could have added other types of approaches here, and then the broader project of remediating social inequalities. So the photo below comes from the Amputees Cup in Sierra Leone, which involves ex-combatants in a very vigorous game of football. So what are the principal findings on this? And sorry for a bit of a crowded PowerPoint slide. But nonetheless, what we find is that it's not simply, and this echoes in the literature as well, social cohesion is not simply a matter of the number of ethnic groups or the number of identity groups. In fact, there's some suggestion that bimodal distribution of identity groups, like in Northern Ireland or Cyprus, or even three-way, for example, in Bosnia, can be more difficult than the societies that have many ethnic groups, 11 different home languages, official home languages in South Africa, for example. I do believe that there is a very direct relationship between societal or horizontal level social cohesion and politics, or the vertical axis. Social cohesion is often undermined by unequal access to state resources, services, and land rights. I'm just back from South Africa, and again, how much time do we have to talk about this questions of unequal access still now, again, 20 years after the a peace agreement, after the Constitution was adopted in the mid-90s, 96. And equally, social cohesion is about what, again, drawn from social psychology, is called parity of esteem. That is that all identity groups in society are seen as more or less equal, not in a matter of esteem, or again, it's that social psychological dimension. That there are myths and realities of inclusivity, and I think this may be the most important aspect for development practitioners, is that there may be a practical and normative barriers to inclusivity. And that's something that we can talk about, particularly when it comes to very specific elements of program and project design. So in interfaith dialogue, well, who are the participants? Who decides who are the participants? Do the participants themselves decide? Do the communities decide? And what are the effects of that? So what is even the process of thinking about putting together an interfaith dialogue? In areas where there are established religions and very deeply established churches, it may be easier, but religion is changing rapidly around the world. You may have Pentecostalist traditions or other kinds of religious faiths that in a community that may not be well reflected by a traditional church approach. And so this is, again, an area I think is very important around interfaith dialogues. So we came up with 7 major conclusions in our research. One is that development assistance actors face a dilemma, and this is a true dilemma. This is not a dilemma that can be easily resolved by ingenuity or whatnot, and it's what we have called the empowerment dilemma. That if development assistance is targeted primarily for the marginalized, for the poor, the excluded, as it should be, and rights-based approaches are brought in, that this empowerment of marginalized groups begins to put the fingers on the scale of power within any society or any community. So development assistance providers are then seeing very, very intrusive into political dynamics locally. The greater the degree of exclusion and inequality, the more the donors focus on it, the more there may be pushback, which is common in development assistance, but not just pushback, but actual hostility, particularly under conditions of political capture, right? Where you, in Sri Lanka, I think during the Rajapaksa period, is probably the strongest case on this approach of the empowerment dilemma that development assisters and assistant providers, and in fact humanitarian assistance providers also face. There are that direct approaches typically deal with dialogue, and dialogue processes are good, but dialogue without action on the ground leads to what's been called dialogue fatigue.
Yeah, sure. Analysis paralysis.
Absolutely. Indirect approaches are focused primarily on building interdependencies. And this is where I come out at the end of the paper. I like indirect approaches. I argue for complementary approaches because I don't want to dismiss the direct dialogue approaches, but I think indirect approaches may be more effective. There can be problems with parallelism when informal institutions like peace committees are created to try to resolve social cohesion problems in the context of transitions. Norms matter, and this is where I believe we are very much back to rights-based approaches. So I have a current project going just now with the help of the Carnegie Corporation, so I'm here in town, on rights-based approaches to peace building. And we're looking at cases that are now 15, 20 years beyond a peace agreement. So this focusing communities around what is justice, what is fairness is an important approach. Engaging the internationalized nature of religion, which I mentioned, complementarity, and the implications for operational and structural prevention. I think this is, for the structural prevention side, I think it's more long-term. For operational prevention, for social cohesion programming, very important implications. So what are these? The first would be, and I'd be happy to walk through a typology of different approaches. They're in the paper that deal with the sort of rationale of the approach, the instruments that are commonly used for this, and then some of the issues that come up in any particular approach. For example, women's dialogues to bring in a gender approach. To what extent do women either networks such as ONEP in West Africa or others, to what extent do they actually, what is the operational mechanism that leads to conflict prevention? So let me just say this because I know I'm almost out of time, and I think this is the most important question that I would have for UNDP and others, would be right around this important issue of, okay, so we have programs and projects that seek to bring communities together, youth dialogue, sport for peace, environmental projects, etc., that try to stitch communities together. But what is the relationship between having a network or having an activity? How does that relate to preventing escalation? And so a lot of the literature in this points to the fact that, okay, so if you have, let me stick with an example, an interfaith network or association, to what extent does the religious leader involved in the interfaith network have the ability to go to those who would perpetrate violence and say, no, look, slow down, hold back, this isn't going to get us what we want. How do they affect armed actors, and how do they affect those perpetrators of violence? And so this becomes a very, very close analytical assessment of who should be involved, how inclusive is a particular process, and what are the very localized mechanisms by which elites, that's my term, these elites can inhibit conflict from escalating. I have one little example. I'll borrow 1 minute just to say that looking, for example, at northern Lebanon, in the case of Tripoli in northern Lebanon, it's very interesting how there was the beginning of spillover of conflict from Syria, and you could see, some low-level violence starting to happen in Tripoli, but there was a very sort of active network based on the Lebanese context, right? It's the very local Lebanese context of inhibiting this violence from occurring, because this was very divisive during the Lebanese Civil War. Incidents that happen in Tripoli are reacted to very quickly. So after a very long story from a Lebanese colleague who described how the local networks work in Tripoli, and what are the means of communication across, say, religious divides, or across lines of conflict. Who calls whom to prevent a particular crisis from becoming worse? And so this is a case of where there was the starting of a bit of violence in Tripoli, and yet it was limited and did not escalate and did not drag northern Lebanon into the Syria context. So these are the mechanisms of conflict prevention that link the overall approach of social cohesion to actually preventing conflict from escalating. And this, to me, I think is the most important aspect. So sorry, that was a bit of an aside. Back to the conclusions. You can see here some of the conclusions. I think the most important one that I'll highlight is the next to last one is this idea of so-called insider partials. That it's not necessarily those that are seen as bridge builders that are the ones. This is drawing on some of the literature of Lederach and other conflict transformation ties that say, well, it's the insiders who are partial but are able to bridge. And so this is the notion of bridging social cohesion, how it happens. I think there are dangers for direct approaches. The dangers for direct approaches include dialogue fatigue, but they also that there's a danger in saying that this project is designed to foster social cohesion. Because if it doesn't, then the sponsor is the one blamed for not fostering social cohesion, whereas the problem may be beyond the sponsor's ability, civil society organization, for example. So the danger of direct approaches is there. There are also some dangers as well from indirect approaches, which we could talk about, risks of indirect approaches and other things, particularly, for example, youth programming. I think there are a lot of risks in youth programming that are not often identified, but should be identified. But nonetheless, this is, again, it's a huge topic of social cohesion. When it comes to promoting bridging social cohesion, I would argue that bridging social cohesion is critical because bonding social cohesion, which I didn't define, I should have defined, bonding social cohesion is cohesion within a group. And when I presented this, I'll conclude with this remark. When I presented this to a colleague, well, it was in South Africa, a colleague of mine who does work on Rwanda, Yolanda Buka from Institute for Security Studies, came up and said, hey, Tim, we have to understand that social cohesion also is created in the act of violence, and that that bonding social cohesion can come from everything from gang rituals to fraternity hazing to genocide, and that one has to be very, very explicit that the kind of social cohesion that should be fostered by international development assistance providers is clearly focused on bridging. So with that, I'll conclude the presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm cognizant of the time, but just maybe, very, very briefly, first of all, to say on the bonding, that Rwandan case came to mind because the best known book about Rwanda really talks about how genocide was a community building exercise first and foremost. And therefore, we are obviously looking at, when we look at horizontal inequalities, the bridging part is the part that is essential here. Just perhaps to say that we got an amazingly useful mapping of issues and trends on social cohesion in on very different levels, from assessing to looking at tools and so on and so forth. 3 minutes, and then I'll let others ask the questions, and then the final word will be with you because of the limits of time. But just to say what would be our primary interest related to the study in terms of social cohesion, just to reinforce that idea that in many ways the sustaining peace changes turns the page on where we go in looking for conflict prevention, in the sense that we are looking for it before the outbreak, and largely in the period of preventing escalation. So these are the elements that where we want to basically say that cost-benefit analysis beyond the human suffering shows that if we in fact invest in the context of, so we don't react as whether we are diplomatic or security or development actors, we don't react to violence as we usually do. And then instead of development, suddenly comes in mediation, and then comes after the CPA comes in security, and then after the post-conflict period we go back to development. No, all three need to work, but they also need to work mostly on the social and political polarization. And that is precisely the point that where we want to see how and through which means can these three actors come together and in fact work on social and political polarization. We also have a study that now shows that if we are able to prevent escalation within the first year of the violence in the Uppsala mode, meaning under 25, over 25 and less than 1,000 deaths, that in that context we still can set the country on a pathway where we don't have to see a conflict trap coming back in terms of recurrence, and that there's massive savings to be had. So on that note, I think for us would be interesting to see how we do what some in the German FFO recently called the real prevention, because we usually work on prevention once the violence already happened, and we work on prevention of recurrence, not the inception and the outbreak or the escalation so much. Escalation, we do have some tools. Also, what is important for us to see here, and I think the direct and indirect and assessing at the different advantages and disadvantages of these approaches are very important for us. But I think we wanted to show what works, basically, and not so that there are certain ways through which we can work on social cohesion that do make a difference, and there are certain patterns that will show us in different contexts that this is so. So that is another thing that we look at. And then the third thing is obviously opening the vertical side where inequalities have been playing a very important role, and there's for example, the land identity nexus that you would be very interested to hear, because obviously this is one of the things that grievances come forward and so on and so forth. There's a number of things that I can't really touch on, but we're also looking not so much on institutions, as you mentioned, and on state building top down, where we look at security and justice institutions. We want to look also at the actors or agencies and how they mobilize, and who is actually whether there are certain ideologies or non-ideologies at work. What is it that mobilizes people? We also want to look at basically the structural conditions, whether these conditions are political culture, whether they are natural endowments that the country has, climate change, and so on and so forth. But that institutions are only one important part of the picture. We need to look much more broadly. So that's something that I just want to throw in for you to think and perhaps respond, and I want to let others, come in with questions.
I have two things. Okay, maybe I just, because while I'm at it. I know you says what formal institutions rarely reverse informal practice. While that's true, I think it sets if it's implemented, it sets for us to act differently, and over a period of time it might affect informal institutions. For example, 33% women in Nepal's constitution went from 0 to 33, boom, we are like top, I don't know what in the world, and everyone is looking at it. But are the women the kind of women, it doesn't matter, they are women. They will have a voice, it will take time, but they will empower themselves, right? And there will be different kinds of women who will get into a constitution. So there's a whole time frame for that, I think. It does set a stage for different behavior patterns, if not practices.
Right.
And practices will come, I think. And there's a question of leadership. I think, Georgie touched on it a little bit. and how international actors, we go in and with, direct social cohesion interventions, and we entrench leaders that should not be there. Right? We've all done it. We've all done it before we, get into this, and it's sexy because it's a political project. They're dealing with some political leaders, but probably they are not the leaders that we should be working with. So we kind of, acknowledge these people who are actually, who've captured, who are the political elites. And we tend to work with political elites most of the time, right? So when it comes to the mobilization, it's these political elites who mobilize the grievances. Maybe it's linked to their own greed for power and thing, but I see that at least in the Madhes, no? You see, there are strong inequalities, no doubt. There are issues. But then I remember going village to village, asking, Madhesis, right? And I'm from Madhes, asking them, okay, in their language, and they know me, I'm from there because of the way I speak Nepali. I speak differently from the people from the hills, but I'm from the hill, right? I'm from the hill, living in the plains, okay, and seen as an outsider, but because of my accent, they'll just know that, oh, she's been here for generations, right? Ask them, do you know what federalism is? People don't know. Farmers don't know. My neighbors don't know, okay? But it's a big agenda for the political elites. Right. So so there is this whole, the whole ethnic movement, and I'm linking it with the social movement paper, also the earlier one which was presented, how the elites capture that, and how that affects social cohesion, and how we, as development actors, as outsiders, we go in and we work with these elites. The institutions are also captured by the elites, and we work with these elites, and I think there is something here that we might want to look at. And the other thing, maybe while we are at the discussion on the elites and institutional capture and the political space capture, you were also talking about, there was this thing of empowerment and how we empower, right? But we empower people I feel like most of us in the development thing, we talk about empowerment at a certain level. Let's say that group gets empowered and comes up to a level of where they are able to engage in a political space, right?
Right.
Then what do we do? And I'm not sure we are clear about it. We're just talking about giving livelihoods, we're talking about giving basic social services, but or education, but at a certain point they're able to voice and engage in a political space, and I'm not sure we are prepared. Finally, we did a mapping of UNDP's social cohesion work across 37 countries, and which Alex and myself will talk to you about later, linked to this paper also, but we did see the direct and indirect approaches. Okay, we did see a lot of the infrastructures of peace, the working with the insider mediators, and we did see that. But what I felt when I saw the mapping was it's all like piecemeal. Because there is some money coming from somewhere, let's do some conflict prevention project, let's do social cohesion project, but it's not like coherent as a country office or as a UNCD. Okay, this is our approach, and how we all come in. Because UNICEF has huge presence, right? And how do they do it? And they have some mandates that we don't. We just say we have 250,000 seed funding, and we do social cohesion. Very, very dangerous. Okay, or on flip side, what I saw in Myanmar, $8 million for livelihoods and social cohesion, spend it in a year. Very dangerous.
Yes.
We should be able to design projects that are 5 years at the minimum. Results will come in later. UN country office needs to know, or UNDP needs to know, results don't come in immediately. Show me social cohesion results. They're still fighting.
Okay, I'm just cognizant this limited time, so.
Can I just jump in here, because this
Please.
is exactly my question, in terms of how much, whether in the broader study or in the background paper, you actually are able to extrapolate some recommendations for project and program design, because we're hearing increasingly that we need to be flexible and adaptive, and that our programming needs to be iterative and able to respond quickly when we see that we're off track, and yet we're still so driven, especially in an organization like UNDP. I mean, the project that I manage is entirely external to what the core donor contributions are to UNDP, and so we are still bound to some extent by our yearly results log frame that we have to give to the donors, and the donors increasingly have to give to their parliaments in order to justify the funding, which wasn't the case a handful of years ago to the extent that it is now. And so we feel pressure from both sides because yes, we want to show that we're flexible and adaptive and problem driven and people centered and rights based and all of this, but we still are to some extent bound by this log frame. So it seems like this is an area where there could be easily some quick wins, so to speak, because you're not dealing with the depth and intensity and time and money required to do institution building. But at the same time, you're dealing with these cases where these groups have never coexisted together. They've always coexisted alongside each other, or the multitude of things where it's never going to be quick and never going to be easy. So,
but maybe a discussion on insider outsider. The dynamics. I know you talked about the insider partials, right? But the whole insider-outsider dynamics, I think, also impact the way, because I have politicians who've been in dialogue sessions who come to me after the meeting because I'm Nepali, and they speak to me in Nepali, come to me and say, did I say the right thing? All done. Did they hear what they had to hear? Bye. And I'm like,
Okay, let's come back to that. Anybody else, please?
There are quite a few people online. We had 11, I think now it's down to 9, but they don't have any questions.
Okay. Anybody in the room still? Before we let, okay. So including the question of how to do, for example, if I understand you correctly, it's about how do and what is the role of international assistant providers in regards to the national assistant providers, especially on a question of social cohesion, and to a large extent, we traditionally see this as being, benevolent agents that are outside of the political economy. And we very much would like to say that we're part of the actors and agencies, and we are part of the political economy as much as anybody else. How does that change the game? And that's the question that I think you were in some ways pointing at.
Yeah, or we are rejected outright.
Right.
Or there are some instances where we are rejected outright, right?
Yeah, I think it was a good set of questions. I'll work through each one's in terms of just going back to the overall question of assessment of social cohesion. I realized I wasn't able to mention the issue of development of social cohesion indices and different approaches to developing quantitative measures of social cohesion. It's a very difficult area. There have been efforts in different places, some of which are very difficult to, even if you had the data, would be very difficult to put out there because it would be highly politically sensitive within any context. And so I have even though there are good efforts to put together either national or subnational indices of social cohesion in order to try to show progress over time, these may be very difficult to develop, at least difficult to develop and publicly produce. In at least several places where we did research, we found that donor efforts to develop quantitative measures that could show benchmarking and progress in social cohesion were difficult to measure. In part because there is also, I guess, at one point we wondered, what is the antonym, what is the opposite of social cohesion? And could you measure the absence of social cohesion rather than the presence of it, right? And so this is a very interesting question. There is a body of literature on measuring social distance. And so value surveys, attitudinal surveys may be a better approach than trying to develop some sort of multidimensional empowerment index, as one project by the bank, World Bank, tried to do. I think in the case of Nepal, as I recall, but a report that was never able to be produced in the local context because it was much too sensitive. So this question of assessment is important, and I think it's also very important as well for very, very close-in localized assessments. So in the case of South Africa recently there was a description, a project partner, we have the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, CSVR, did a very interesting study that's coming out on their Community Works program, where they looked at where state-led community works, livelihoods programming have been brought into various townships. And in some places, what they found empirically was that how the Community Works program was implemented had a strong effect on violence in that community. So what they found was that essentially, in areas where there was very highly localized political capture, the very same program didn't work in areas where there was greater involvement of ex-combatants, very interestingly, and less political capture, that they had less violence. And so they're really able to show empirically what's the holy grail of conflict prevention, which is being able to show almost in a randomized control trial, sorry for that one, but almost like in a medical trial where you would say, well, this got the treatment and this group didn't get the treatment and this one showed progress and didn't. So it's this question of a very localized assessment of the extent of coherence within a community, and then how that coherence is built, who does the actual conflict prevention work becomes very important. And again, social distance measures may get one down the road on that. So attitudinal surveys. The second, it relates actually to the second question on leadership, and but also the issue of, well, indirect approaches may go well beyond UNDP. I was very fortunate to be involved 2 years ago in Colombia with a week-long retreat of the UN country team as they were developing their development assistance framework, a 5-year program. And what was kind of interesting to me, and maybe this is where the finding on indirect really comes, is that those who could speak most to social cohesion were actors that I hadn't considered as involved in the project of promoting social cohesion. This is World Food Program, this is UNICEF.
So it was an UNDAF, not just UNDP, right?
It was an UNDAF. There were all 22 members of the
yeah.
country team was there. IOM was there. IOM can be very important in this regard as well. But what I found was that it was really through the coordination of the resident representative that, and this was a facilitated week-long workshop in anticipation of the Havana Agreement about what do we do in the post-Havana process to build localized social cohesion. So it's very interesting that to me this sort of coordinator role, the operating guidelines kind of role that UNDP plays, it sort of helps harness the entire work of the UN country team. But I think it does require, for every context, a very clear, explicit, I would call it strategic idea about what is social cohesion in this context, given the history, given the narratives, given the natures of exclusion and marginalization, and what is the kind of cohesion that is most likely to prevent conflict from escalating within a particular context. So it may look very different in Northern Ireland or Lebanon than it does in Nepal or South Africa. Just given the sort of range of groups and the type of context in which one works. So to me this was very important that UNDP plays it does mostly, from what I could tell, the direct social cohesion programming, but then also had a very important role in coordination among all the other members of the UN country team. This leads to, I guess, a third point I would just highlight that I've been very interested in the work of the National Commission on Social Cohesion in Kenya. Yeah, and so you get these sort of formal bodies that are often created after conflict events to sort of go about the work of social cohesion. It was really quite interesting. We had a 2-day workshop with the National Commission on Social Cohesion in Kenya. It was very, very interesting. And some of the sort of dilemmas and challenges that they face when you have, and this gets to your point about formal institutions or, informal institutions rarely change, practices. I have to go back to my slide here on exactly how I phrased it. But the point of Kenya was that there's a sort of a national recognition of the need to promote social cohesion, new constitutional framework, decentralization, etc. But the importance of promoting social cohesion falls to this body, which is trying to manage social media, much of which happens outside of the country, hate speech, etc. So this is all around the conflict prevention around the elections at the moment too. That these institutions that are created to promote social cohesion deal with very entrenched social divisions, deal with patterns of clientelism and patronage, often along ethnic lines in the case of Kenya, and that this becomes a very sort of difficult thing for these big formal institutions. Perhaps the last point I would say on international assistance providers and how that works. To me, it seems the most common process is that international development assistance providers choose among local NGOs or evaluate local NGOs for their authenticity, their legitimacy, their own networks and ties. I was really struck by a project that's being done by IPI, Andrea O'Sullivan across the street here, a very interesting project on focusing, rather than international development assistance trying to focus and get a single civil society organization to promote social cohesion, the approach of looking at networks begins to say, okay, who's connected to whom and in what ways, and how are local peace builders connected at the national level, to the regional level, to the local level, and how can development assistance providers begin to think more in terms of networks than organizations. And I thought that was a very interesting approach to say that, well, because it may be difficult to say that this particular civil society organization is the one to sponsor this dialogue, maybe it's a network of civil society organizations that are sponsoring a dialogue, so that it's not comes down to a single program officer within that civil society organization say, okay, we're going to have an interfaith dialogue, we're going to invite these people to be members.
We have one question from the audience which very much links to your question, because it also is related to Nepal. It's our colleague Chris Mahoney, who says, with descriptive versus authentic inclusion, have you observed tensions between these asserting inclusion where inclusion is descriptive and the marginalized persons themselves as their capacity to enable authentic inclusion advances? Nepal is in this regard, in regards to victims, I just got a message, to victims of crimes is a good example. Elites in civil society becoming antagonized by their displacement in public discourse by capacitated victims groups. So there were certain groups in the civil society that were able to, and more articulate and part of transitional justice processes, who kind of where, to a large extent, according to some who wrote about Nepal, have set particular standards and needs for these groups, while if and when the researchers went into communities, they found that there were different needs amongst the victims themselves.
All the time.
So that there was a discrepancy. So there's some sense of capture possibly within the civil society group So how do we deal with that through the networking thing, or is there another remedy for something like this?
Can I just add to this question and the example that he gave? Since we're talking about Nepal, all NGOs are politically affiliated, given, right? Networks are also politically affiliated. We try to work on building collaboration and dialogue for women networks in UNDP on the citizenship issue, right? And then we realized it's not a single network. There are 5 networks, 5 NGOs from women's networks and different affiliation, and they hated each other. So you have to then bring, such a huge coalition to distribute your own risks also.
Yes.
Right? Because it's completely captured by the politics. And this is for transitional justice, for everything. What may you?
Yeah.
Right.
Very good. It's a very good question, Chris, and the related question as well I think this is the most difficult area of practice, actually, and it does often involve very close, almost ethnographic assessments, and again, down to the local level. This was why I was struck by the work of CSVR, where they're going into any particular township community to do before an intervention, and there's some very good sociologists actually at Watersrand University who are doing this too, to really look at the dynamics within a particular community and then trying to craft a very specific sets of incentives with the Community Works program for a particular community, such that there is really no one-size-fits-all. It requires a lot more diligence on the assessment side than what may be possible. This is where, as an academic, I can say do more diligence on the assessment side, and then I can walk away and leave it for you all to do, given one-year project deadlines, funding streams, and other exigencies which you mentioned. But to me, this becomes very important. I was struck by on this very issue about the controversy that was sparked by the funding of DFID, of the Nepal Federation of Indigenous Groups, NEFIN.
Yeah.
And so this is where I increasingly come around to the point of view that maybe the best approach is to do social cohesion programming, in my remarks with this, without calling it social cohesion programming. As a most effective method, that the development outcomes are there, the livelihoods outcomes, the violence reduction outcomes are there, but the actual sort of articulation of the goal that this is designed to promote social cohesion could
or
be
reconciliation.
Or reconciliation even further.
We haven't touched on it, but yeah.
Yes. It's very difficult to measure, and it's difficult particularly, again, for conflict prevention, because it's a counterfactual, right?
Yeah.
And we funded this local network of actors. Either violence did or did not break out. How do we know whether it would have broken out if we hadn't done it? So this is always going to be the problem of conflict prevention. It's inherent in the counterfactual. But nonetheless, I do think that the indirect approaches where social cohesion is fostered as almost a side benefit of other outcomes. The Sport for Peace programming outcomes are health and nutrition and organizational capacity and displacement from gangs or insurgency groups or violent groups. That these are the sort of explicit goals, but the equally important goals can be around broader, importance of building these networks at the very local level across the coaches, for example, and various football teams and other things. Had a lot of interesting close-in look at the Sport for Peace programming in this regard, that often the benefit of social cohesion is there, but it's not sort of put out there as such, that the very purpose of this project is to promote social cohesion. So promoting social cohesion without calling it social cohesion may be an integrated finding.
Okay, on that note, I want to really thank you. We'll take that message forward. I think it sounds, you made such a good case for it. And we really want to thank you for coming and finding time, and we hope in the future we'll be able to have you again when a new installment of your work comes around.
Very good. Thank you so much, and it was a real pleasure. And thank you, everyone.